is missing. It would have gone up much taller. You would have been able to stand in the space. So kivas are going to be the round rooms, and every site in Mesa Verde pretty much has kivas. Kivas are going to be the gathering point, exactly. Think of them kind of as a living room. We do know that daily functions are happening in there, cooking, weaving. We just find evidence of daily life habitation. But we also know that they're spiritual rooms, and we know that from several lines of evidence. First off, the Pueblo people still build kivas today. Those are their primary religious centers and community gathering points. So Pueblo people, 800 years later, today, still build this form of architecture. Kiva is actually a Hopi word for this kind of architecture. But also we know that they're spiritual because there's a lot of them around the park. They all look the same. They all have very similar elements, so there's definitely a ritualistic aspect that's being placed on the kiva. Kivas are often, or pretty much they're always dug into the ground. Here in the cliff dwellings, they're not always dug down into the ground, but what you do see is that they build square rooms, build a circular kiva inside, backfill the square with fill, and then they'll place their home architecture up around it. So they're still keeping the kiva submerged comparatively to the rest of their architecture. So there's a few aspects about a kiva I want to talk about, and we'll see better examples of kivas as we move up. But kivas all have some similar features. They're round. They usually have these pillars or pilasters that go around them, and that's where the lattice of beams would sit to create the roof structure. And then you have to imagine, again, this wall of the kiva would go up much higher. Right here, you'd have a ventilation shaft, and that would bring fresh air in to feed the fire, which would be in the center of the kiva. And all kivas have this little wall. That's the deflector wall. As fresh air comes down to feed the fire, you don't want it blowing across the fire, so you create this wall so the air deflects around, allowing the smoke from the fire to move up and directly out. And it would move directly out a hatch up top, and that would be your route in and out of the kiva via a ladder. Yeah. There's going to be a better example of a kiva up top. In fact, we'll be able to peer into a kiva that still has part of its original roof structure that's been standing for over 850 years.
Any idea, is that ventilation or drainage? Or?
Those other little niches? Yeah. Kiva walls also have niches, and they're probably just to set items into.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Little storage areas, or maybe if it is for religious purposes, like the Hopi and Zuni have the Kachina Society, and Kachinas would have been probably a thing that originated here. Yeah.
And this was not just...
Yeah, and we can even get into that now.
When did they discover this? Wasn't it early 1900s?
So the late 1800s. The late 1800s is when the Wetherill family moves down to Mancus, the town of Mancus. You might have passed through it. They moved down to the town of Mancus, and they like to say they discovered these sites, but we're trying to rework that narrative too. That story was perpetuated by Willa Cather, who's an amazing writer. But she wrote about the Wetherills early on. So as the story goes, it was a cold winter day, and the Wetherills were grazing their cattle up here in the canyons. And it begins to snow, and they look up through the canyon, and there is Cliff Palace. It's a really romantic tale. Yeah. But we know it's not true. I mean, there's no way they would pass by, 400 other cliff dwellings before getting to Cliff Palace. Yeah. But also, this was Ute land at the time. And the Wetherills had a good relationship with the Utes. There was a Ute guide by the name of Akowitz, and Akowitz probably showed them many of these sites, toured them around this landscape. So the Wetherills were here in the late 1800s, and these sites had already been visited by Anglo settlers before. We have evidence of inscriptions of earlier cowboys coming through the landscape, writing their name in charcoal that predate the Wetherills. Wow. However, the Wetherills were the ones to popularize them. They're the ones to say, like, hey, we're going to start collecting artifacts and send them to the Smithsonian. We're going to bring people in to visit. They start giving the very first tours. So right at the end of the 1800s, they invite in a Swedish geologist by the name of Gustav Nordenskjöld. He's young. He's in his early 20s. He has tuberculosis, actually. That's why he's here in the Southwest. He meets the Wetherills. He's really excited to dig. He writes home to his father. His father sends money, and it's with that Swedish aristocratic money that comes the first excavations to Mesa Verde.
Nice.
So yeah, Gustav is digging through the site. He's digging through all our big sites, including this one. You can actually see a number he carved into the rock that was part of his numerical a numbering system of the sites.
Right.
So Gustav is here, and he's finding the best artifacts. He's finding all the good stuff. The preservation's incredible. So the architecture's preserved, but imagine all the artifacts inside that preserved. The oyas, the jars, yucca fiber sandals, yucca fiber rope. He found a jar in the step house that had a yucca fiber rope, and he stretched it out, and it was 2 football fields long.
Wow.
Yeah, it just the material culture here is
Made
insane.
that?
I made
Turkey feather
one
blankets,
this like 2 yards.
prairie dog pouches,
How long did it
typically
take you?
treated in salt.
Months.
But
It took
Gustav,
me like 10
he's
hours.
taking all these artifacts, and he's here for about a year excavating, and he decides that he's going to take all the artifacts back home. He actually only makes it as far as Durango originally. The people of Durango are so fed up when they see him loading about 3 or 4 box carts full of artifacts. They're so upset that they actually get the county sheriff, and he's arrested before he leaves. But this is right at the turn of the century. There's no law in the books keeping those artifacts in the country, so he does take those artifacts. And to this day, the majority of artifacts from all of our big sites, Cliff Palace, Mug House, Step House, Square Tower House, they're in Helsinki, Finland.
Oh my
That's
gosh.
where,
Really?
That's where they ended up.
I
Yeah.
thought maybe the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
That would at least make a little
Yeah,
more
they're at the
sense.
They're at the National Gallery at Helsinki, and I'm not quite
jeez.
sure how they ended up there, but I do know at the time Finland and Sweden were operating under the same political system and crown. So that's where they. That's where they
Have you
are.
ever gone to visit them?
I have not.
Oh.
I would love to. The story's still unfolding. The Pueblo people have made multiple requests over the years that those artifacts get returned, especially the funerary objects and burials. Gustav didn't just take the fine pottery and blankets. He took whole human
Everything.
remains. Right. That was the archaeological practice at the time. You just scoop it all up and you go. And that was the practice. I mean, in our museum, in our park, we had her name was Esther. Her name was absolutely not Esther, but they referred to her as Esther. There was a mummified individual, a naturally mummified individual who was on display in our museum through the 80s. It was the first thing you saw when you walked through our museum door for decades. So that was just kind of a standard practice of American museums up until quite recently. So Gustav, he took a lot of human remains with him, as did the Smithsonian and the other institutions who would soon follow. But the Pueblo people did request that those items get returned, and last year they complied. It was really cool. It was during COVID, so the park was really quiet. Several hundred human remains were returned, and several Pueblo tribes came in order to reintern them in the park. And
Where
Nice.
are the special burial sites, and is it in part of the dwelling, or underneath? Or?
so we find burials out front, largely in the softer soils below the site. We don't really find cemeteries, and there's not evidence of cremation, so people are being buried out and about on the landscape in
Yeah.
kind of individual burials.
Were there special artifacts they buried
Yes,
them with?
so they often are buried with pieces of pottery. Here at Mesa Verde, they're all about their mugs, and people are buried usually with a mug, and the mugs usually have very intricate and singular designs. So I don't know. I love that because every morning whenever I make my coffee, I always go for the same mug.
Yeah.
And I always have to wash out that mug. I have dozens of mugs, and I have to use the same one. I have no idea why, but I imagine people had that kind of connection to some of their objects, so much so that they're buried with them. And we can learn some interesting things from burials. I'm glad that we don't excavate burials anymore. It's not a standard practice. If archaeologists in the park find a human burial, they stop digging there and they dig somewhere else.
It's illegal now, right?
Yeah, under DAGPRA legislation, the tribes, the affiliated tribes have a say on how we approach given burials. And so working with our affiliated tribes, it's a no-go, and rightfully so. It's good that we're respecting those practices and beliefs. But burials have given some information to archaeologists in the past. Gustav, he's coming in with that European mindset, right? He thinks that these are palaces or forts. He thinks that the people who are living in the cliff dwelling are better off than maybe the people living on the mesa top. He's probably a little disappointed though when he starts excavating the burials. If you're expecting to see social hierarchy, what would you expect to find in the burials?
Gold and something.
Jewelry.
Yeah,
Right.
jewels.
Finer objects. The people here are buried with finer objects than the people up top. Maybe you'd find finer objects in the room. You can also see it on nutrition level. Maybe the people here are healthier individuals than people elsewhere. That's actually not really the case. All the burials around our park look pretty much the same. which suggests maybe a bit more of an egalitarian way of life than Gustav had initially thought. Not to say that social hierarchy didn't exist other places in the Pueblo world. If you go down to Chaco, Chaco is an incredible Pueblo site just south of us. They reached their height or population boom in the 1000s, 100 years before Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings. If you have a chance to go to Chaco, it's amazing. Has anyone been? All right, so they weren't building in the cliff dwellings at that time, but they were building down on the canyon floors, big stone pueblos. If you go to Chaco today, you can see Pueblo Benito. It has 750 rooms. It's a Park Service site, and you can actually like crawl through some of the rooms still. There's 5 stories of architecture coming off the desert floor. Chaco is incredible because there is very strong evidence of social hierarchy. They found a room with these cylindrical vessels. They swabbed the vessels like the archaeologists did, and they found chocolate in every single one. Chocolate is being traded in from the Maya world. They found rooms filled with macaw bones and feathers. There's an exotic parrot trade that was taking macaws, prized for their feathers, to Chaco as well.
Wow.
But even more odd is that there was that pueblo of 750 rooms, but based on the number of fire pits and hearths, only about 40 to 70 people lived in it. And you find that the people who are living inside are healthy individuals, and people on the outskirting communities have malnutrition and other things like that. So there was definitely hierarchy in the Pueblo world at different time periods, but we don't see that at Mesa Verde. So we think that there's different political shifts and different political ways of life within the greater Pueblo world.
Was Chaco about the same time as this or later?
Chaco's 100 years before Mesa Verde, and you actually see a population decline at Chaco, and our sites get bigger, so people from Chaco are probably coming up to this northern region. And it's important to note this because when we talk about the leaving of Mesa Verde, it's probably not as alarming as you might think. These people have been migrating around the landscape, and we have to kind of think of it as like a nation. People are going to move to the area of the Pueblo world where there's the greatest amount of success. It's the same thing that's happening today. Yeah.
So when a drought came in 1200, they just
Exactly.
moved elsewhere.
Right. Well, let's continue on to the middle of the site. More about directly the architecture, kind of get more into site specifics. Now that we've kind of covered so many of the So preservation aside, just the architecture itself is amazing, right? The square corners, the crafted blocks. Take a look and you'll see the dimples on the rocks. That's where all of these rocks have been pecked down, carved, and shaped. The sandstone here doesn't really plane off in regular ways. All of these blocks really have to be worked. And in order to do that, you have to do it by hand with stone tools.
Right.
This is a Stone Age society. And if you look around, all the rocks around, it's all sandstone. If you take sandstone and hit it against sandstone, what's going to happen? Yeah, you need a harder rock. So what we find is that the Pueblo people are going down to the Mincas River about 2 miles to the south of us. And what's coming down with that river? And all those the rock cobbles coming down from the Rocky Mountains. So you're gonna have different types of stone. So you go down to the Mincas River, you get the harder river rock, you bring it back, and we have grooves along the rocks. There's one up here that we're gonna pass. You would sit down on a sandstone rock and you take that harder rock and grind it against it to create a chisel or an axe. Even just creating the tools to create this is a lot of work. But the amount of time and energy that went into these pueblos is quite incredible. They want to create the blocks as square as possible, because the squarer the block, it means you need to use less mortar in between them. And mortar, what does mortar require?
Water.
It requires water. So the finer the block, the less mortar, which also means a greater and more stable wall. The mortar that they're using is really just a mud recipe. There's not added elements to bind it together, so it does erode away. And that's one reason why they want to use less mortar, and they're also going to put mortar on top, plastering the wall, so less water gets into the mortar of the wall itself. And so
So
there's
were they literally chipping away here to
We're just building into
use
the
the stone that's here, right here?
well, that's another great reason to live in an alcove. There's going to be a lot of natural stones here to work with.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also find in the 1100s, they are deconstructing a lot of other pueblos and moving them down below. And we see that from the wood. So see the wood protruding from the walls? Those are original beams. The wood has preserved remarkably well. Are you guys familiar with the science dendrochronology? So dendrochronology is the study of tree ring and using tree rings to date sites. So what archaeologists will do is they'll drill into the wood, they'll pull out a sample, and they're going to look at those rings. And when there's less water, what happens to tree rings?
Shrink.
Right, they shrink together. So if you see like 12 rings close together, what do you assume is happening? It's a 12-year drought. So you start taking those drought periods, and those are going to be your calendar markers, and you're going to start overlapping them with other samples you take, creating a chronology going back 1,000 years or more. We also happen to have a tree in our park that's 1,300 years old. So you take a core sample from that juniper tree, and you already have a great basis for that calendar. So dendrochronology is incredible because a lot of archaeologists, they depend on carbon dating and all these other techniques which provide kind of a window of dates. This tells us the exact year the tree was chopped down. Even better, it tells us the season the tree was chopped down. So for any given site, our archaeologists don't just have a floor plan map, they have a very detailed construction map of when each room was added over the years. So we do see in a room like this, say we see 2 trees are chopped down in, let's just pick a date, 1240. But then one of the dates is from 1120. So we assume that room was built at the later time period, but beams are being recycled and reused, which makes a lot of sense. But what was incredible to me is that you still have the lintels on the doorways preserved. Yeah. And look up here at the crow's nest. You see the wood that's still upholding the architecture? That has been stabilized, but based on historic photographs, that wood has kept those walls up. Yeah, and the lintels under the doorways. One of my favorite little features here of construction is if you come up this way, you can actually see a filled-in doorway.
Yeah.
So, they're remodeling. People are living here for 100 years. That's a long time. 100 years might not seem like a long time, but, I mean, not many of us live in a house that's 100 years old. So there's remodeling that's happening. Not only is there remodeling, well, there's 2 periods of remodeling. There's a big doorway that's filled in to make a smaller doorway, and then the smaller doorway is eventually shut off.
Do they have any ancient levels that they use? Because these walls are pretty
They're square.
uniform.
They are pretty uniform. I